Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole van der Hoeven, and on this channel, I like to talk about different ways that I min-max my life, including digital tools like Obsidian. Today, we're going to talk about optimal ways to structure a PKM system, the trade-off between organization and rigidity sometimes, and how to make it so that you always find the notes that you need. But to help me parse through all of this, I've invited a friend of mine, Jorge Arango. Jorge is an information architect, author, educator. He's written 3 books on information architecture, hosts a podcast called The Informed Life, which is awesome, and I've been on it, teaches in the Graduate Interaction Design program at California College of the Arts, and just generally has done a lot of thinking about the different ways to organize structure and present information. Welcome to the channel, Jorge.
Thank you, Nicole. It's very exciting to be here. I'm a fan of your work. I've been following your YouTube channel for a long time. And like I said, you've been on my podcast. You were very gracious to help with the book as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So I'm very excited to be here.
Absolutely. I definitely want to talk about the book. Well, let's talk about it briefly now. I I think I was really happy to read it. Um, the book is called Duly Noted, and it is going to be out next year, right?
Next week, it's actually,
I guess. Well, yeah, next week
yeah,
is next
yeah.
year.
Well, it's January 2nd it's coming out. So it's like literally the clock is now ticking. Yeah.
I like it so much that I was already thinking of like creating my own book along the same lines, and I read it. I'm like, yeah, I don't know if there's anything more to say, really. You nailed it, and I'm not just trying to be nice to you. Like I really love it. I can't wait for more people to read it. I have the advanced copy, but I also pre-ordered it on Kindle because I want the Kindle highlights.
Oh, that's very generous, and thank you for saying that. That said, I would still love to read what you have to say on the subject. Uh, it's funny when I was writing the book, I had kind of the same feeling. I read a lot in preparation for this book, and there were some books that I came across, and I was like, oh my gosh, this person has written a lot of what I would like to say. And then when I think about how my book turned out, it's like it was different. It ended up being different just because it's my own take on the subject, and I think everyone has a slightly different take. So I would love to hear what your take is.
Well, we'll see about that. But one of the interesting things that I read, because I've read you've written 3 books. I've read 2 of them actually, and I have the notes to prove it. But I read that you were educated as an architect, like a physical building architect. But then you decided to be an information architect. But how did that happen?
That was an interesting episode for me. I Well, the first thing I'll say is before studying architecture, I was into computers. So I've been involved with computers for a long time. Um, I don't remember where I heard this, but I heard someone once say that people of my vintage who grew up in the 70s and 80s are part of the
Vintage.
we're part of the first generation of people who grew up with computers as playthings. We had the Atari 2600 and then home computers, and I was one of these kids who grew up trying to make video games in early 8-bit computers, and I ended up studying architecture. And in some ways, architecture was a detour from my love affair with computers. But I did study architecture, and funny enough, when I was in architecture school was when computer-aided design was starting to permeate into architecture as well, at least in a more mainstream way. So I've always been involved with computers, but what happened to me was that I did plan to become an architect, like design buildings. And when I graduated from school with my architecture degree, I practiced for about a year and a half. And then what happened is that the World Wide Web came out. And when I first saw the web, it was like a I had like a conversion moment. Like you read about like who was it, Saul on the way to Damascus or something, and saw the light and fell
Yeah.
off the horse, right? Something like that happened to me when I first saw the web. I had this kind of flash of insight that this was going to change the world in a significant way. I don't know why. In retrospect, I've seen other technologies come out and haven't had. I'm a little more jaded now, but at the time I was like, oh my gosh, this is a transformational technology, and I basically I got into web design and web development, and I also had the realization at that point that many of the things that I had learned about in architecture school would be transferable to this medium, even though literally, it doesn't involve making things with walls and windows and doors. It does involve somehow structuring kind of like places where you're going to do things. Now, I would say that I may be kind of projecting back into it just because that's the way I've kind of rationalized the decision to myself. But it did seem kind of like a natural. And of course, at that time, you couldn't go to school to study any of this stuff, right? So a lot of the people who are my contemporaries also have kind of eclectic backgrounds. I'm starting to ramble a little bit. I know that you just asked me
No,
about the
no,
background in
that's
architecture,
fine.
but
I think it's really interesting because I think that there is a theme here. You were building things already, you're a developer, and then you went into architecture, and then I feel like information architecture is combining the two, but a lot of what you've done and a lot of your interest seems to be about building and structures and organization. So I guess the problem with a lot of that, and obviously not yours, but I think that there are many, many different ways to take notes. It's one of the many things that people are very strongly opinionated on the internet. And a lot of them have very strict methodologies. You were just talking about this before the stream, where there's like a whole bunch of terminology you have to learn before you even do the thing. And what I really like about your approach is it's none of that. It's like first principles and concepts and things that you can apply to really pretty much any tool or environment that you're trying to work with.
that's right. Yeah, and I'd like to circle back to that. I'm just thinking for the benefit of folks listening in. Um, you might be wondering, well, if you said that you got into this doing web design and information architecture, how did you land in the note-taking stuff, right? And and for me, I had been doing this kind of work for a long time, and I've been taking notes for a long time. I've been keeping track of, and I've done it kind of very pragmatically because I have a really bad memory. That's that that's like the my origin story. It's like I do need kind of a prosthetic memory, and and I like to read. And what would happen to me is I would read books, and I would forget where I'd read about something, or I would like read the book and like check it off my list. It's like, yeah, I read that one, but then afterwards I was like, I kind of remember reading about this one thing, but I don't remember exactly where it was that I read that. So I started taking notes. Well, like many people, I took notes when I was in school, just kind of writing down the lecture notes or whatever. But and at work I would take notes of like what was happening in meetings, so meeting minutes. But for my own kind of benefit, I really started taking notes in a more disciplined way around books. And after a while I had the realization that the notes that I took for work, the notes that I took for books, they were all kind of uh, part of my mind that was being kind of externalized. This is a notion that's been very important in my life, and it's obviously none of these ideas are original to me. It's like I've kind of put them together, but this idea of the extended mind, and Annie Murphy Paul has a fantastic book called The Extended Mind, where she explains the research that's been going around that stuff. But the gist of it is that we use our environments, things in our environments, like notebooks. We use them as ways to expand our cognitive abilities, right? So when we think, I think, and this happened to me, like I had this idea that thinking was something that happened up in the meat computer up here, right? And then we externalized whatever we had thought about by writing it in the whiteboard or in a notebook or whatever. And my thinking shifted after learning about this work to understanding that no, actually what happens is the thinking process is happening between your nervous system and things in the world. You know, things like a notebook or an app like Obsidian or a whiteboard. They are part of the thinking apparatus somehow. And that realization, combined with the work that I had been doing as an information architect, led me to think that, hey, I organize information for other people to use in my professional life. And here I am kind of extending my mind through information that I am putting out into the world. And maybe there are things that I can take from the work of information architecture and apply them to how I'm capturing and organizing information in my own personal life. And I started applying some of these principles to my own information management. So that was an important part of my story there. The other one was that about 3 or 4 years ago, we started seeing in the market tools that give us kind of superpowers for this stuff, right? Like, so there have been research projects in labs and stuff for a long time around things like hypertext note taking. And there have been some tools. In the 1980s, Apple put out a tool called HyperCard that was an early hypertext tool. But that didn't catch on. And for the most part, these experiments have been in labs, And what happened I would say about 3 or 4 years ago is that we started seeing software applications like Rome Research and Notion and now Obsidian that bring a lot of this hypertext, these hypertext principles to a more mainstream market. They make it more accessible. And that's been transformational for me. It's really like, at this point, like there are now tools that allow us to really extend our minds powerfully. And if you add those tools plus some of the insights that come from the world of information science and information architecture, you can do really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I really like what you said about, trying to learn and understand the world and kind of taking the external world and creating your own version of it, a curated version of the topics that interest you. I definitely do that along with like recording things and I also use it to create things. So the problem with all of that is that you end up with a lot of notes. Like I'm just looking, I literally have my Obsidian vault up right now. I have 9,717 notes in my main vault. That's not, I have several vaults. So like where would you even start? How do you begin to organize all of this?
That is really challenging, isn't it? And I will say, I think that this is all very emergent. So we have, like you mentioned earlier, like we have principles and we have practices that we can recommend. But I don't think that anyone has very definitive answers right now for something like a 10,000 note 10,000 note repository, right?
Why not? I brought you here for the definitive answers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are things that we can do, right? And you hinted at this in the before the live stream, that we would be talking about things like links and tags and folders, right? And basically these when you think about a note-taking medium, let's think more broadly about any medium that you can use to expand your mental capabilities, right? Um, that could be a whiteboard. It could be a physical notebook. It could be a smartphone. All of those media have different capabilities and constraints, right? There are things that they do well. There are things that they are not very good at. And whenever I'm working with any kind of technology to expand my mind, I like to think about, what does this technology do better than others? What can it help with, right? To give you an example, the paper, it's like I flashed a paper notebook. What does paper do better than digital? Well, paper has a few advantages. One, it doesn't need any batteries. It's always on, right? Like it's immediate access. You can just open the notebook and start writing. It's fairly resilient. We still have books that are several hundred years old, right? So it sticks around. What are the disadvantages? Well, it's really hard to search as compared with computers, right? Like, you can't run a Command F on a bookshelf. Random access is much harder. We have, books have indices and page numbers, which, by the way, are inventions, right? Like, those are not inherent to books; those had to be invented. But it's not as easy to access a particular bit, a particular chunk of information in a book, as it is in something like Obsidian, a hypertext. So think about the capabilities and constraints of the medium. And what we're talking about specifically here are what I like to call connected note-taking apps, or hypertext note-taking apps, right? So something like Obsidian is a way to build a hypertext. And a hypertext is a particular type of artifact, mind extension system, whose core capability is that it allows you to chunk information and then link to it arbitrarily somehow, so that you can create, you can start a note about a particular idea, and then start a note about another idea, and then very easily link to that first idea from the second one, right? And it'll do things like keep track of backlinks. So the second note will show you which notes have incoming links, and vice versa. That is a capability that is not available in something like a paper-based system, right? And you have to look at and I'm saying this because when you say that you have a vault that's approaching 10,000 items, it's going to be much more feasible to do that with a hypertext note-taking app than it is with a paper-based system. Now, folks listening in might be familiar with the whole Zettelkasten thing, and Niklas Luhmann had a paper-based system that had tens of thousands of notes in it, right? And as far as I understand it, it had a fairly elaborate schema for keeping track of relationships between pieces of paper. But my sense, whenever I read about that, is that carries a lot of overhead with it. Whereas something like what you're sharing on the screen, which I assume is a graph of your vault,
It is.
it's doing the tracking of those relationships for you, right? So the neat thing about these systems is that if you think again about the constraints and capabilities of the technology, the link is a kind of primitive of these systems. It's something that is not easy to do with paper, and it's not easy to do with other note-taking apps, right? So something like Apple Notes or Google Keep, they have the ability to have links, but it's not as easy as it is with something like Obsidian. So links, so you have links, and you have links of different varieties, right? So one variety of link is just the kind of regular hyperlink that you create when you, in Obsidian, when you type the double bracket and link to a note with a, by calling out its name. Another type of link are tags, right? So tags are metadata that you assign to nodes to make them easier to find. And that's another, when you say it's like, how do I start organizing 10,000 nodes? Well, with a system that large, and I'm assuming that you did not accumulate 10,000 nodes in a short span. That must have happened over time, right? So,
Absolutely, years, really. I think
right.
this is still. I didn't move over everything from previous ones. I did use Roam Research and Notion. I'd say this is probably about 4 years worth. But yeah, there's more, and I also have notebooks, like actual physical notebooks as well. But you mentioned tags. Now I use links a lot, but tags, I don't really use them that much. Do you? Like, is that something that you use heavily?
I do use tags, but I use tags in a very particular way. So tags are kind of risky, because, and one of the risks with tags, and let me just kind of close off the thought where I was going with the observing that your vault is probably not something that you built up overnight. One of the things that might be different about doing information architecture for something like a website or a knowledge base or something like that is that oftentimes when you're doing that kind of work, you are trying to organize a system that already exists, or you're trying to organize a repository of content that already exists, right? Or that you know what it's going to contain. The website might have it might be like a marketing website, say, and it has products and it has customer support and it has services that the company offers and it has contact details or whatever, right? And each of those things might have categories of content. So then the support part of the site might have a series of topics that customers need support on. The products might have product categories or what have you. So you have these taxonomies that you can assign. And oftentimes that work happens kind of very top down. Like you come at it and you know that if you're working within, I don't know, cybersecurity software, there are certain categories that people expect to see in that space, a certain terminology, certain ways of organizing stuff. So you can assign a lot of the taxonomies kind of from the get-go, from the top down. When you're building up a personal knowledge repository like the one that you're showing, that happens incrementally over time. It's more emergent. Like a lot of the category, like you might start out with a set of interests and develop a completely different set of interests as you go along, right? So it's
Yeah, I thought I was going to take notes just for work. I still do, but also like I also take notes now for games and a bunch of other random things.
Yeah, and I was actually very inspired by your how you're taking notes for your role playing games, right? Like that's, to me, it was an unexpected use for this stuff, but completely obvious once you think about it, right? It makes a lot of sense. Uh, because again, the whole point here is extending your mind somehow. Um, but uh, but you might start. The point here is that you might start the vault thinking that you're going to be doing it for work, for example, and you can say, okay, so because I'm doing it for work, I know that work has these categories, and I'm going to create tags for those categories or what have you, and and then you discover it's like, hey, I could do more than just capture work stuff here. I could do it for my reading, and I could do it for my games, and I could do it for a whole bunch of other stuff. And as you do that, and you end up like coming up with tags on the fly, what you might end up with is a very large set of tags, right? Like you end up, it's kind of like a bottom up taxonomy that you're creating. And the challenge there is that you could end up with a very large set of terms, some of which might be in conflict, right? Like, so, and I can't think of an example right off the bat, but I could imagine that if you are tagging notes for work, there might be a tag that later on you find yourself having to use for your games or something. And then you ask the question, like, well, what sense do I mean this? You know, it's like, do I mean it in the work sense, or do I mean it in the game sense? But the point is, like, it's different to do this from the top down than it is to do it from the bottom up, to make it emergent. And I think that tags can be incredibly powerful, but you have to be very careful with them, because you can end up with a mess, basically. And the approach that I've taken to it is that I am very explicit with the way that I use tags. For a long time, I tried to use tags to describe the thing that I was capturing. You know, it's like if I read a book, for example, I recently read Arnold Schwarzenegger's new book, right? So Arnold Schwarzenegger wrote a self-help book, and it's actually pretty good. But like in the past, if I had read that book, I would have tried to tag it with what I thought the book was about. So like it might have had like a tag called advice, another tag called acting, a tag called bodybuilding, a tag called politics, because those are three things that he's done in his career, right? And then I would try to like describe the book, the content of the book, through the tags. And that is what I think leads to a mess. I've become much more minimalist in my use of tags. Now I use tags explicitly for three things. So I use tags to describe what a thing represents, what a note represents. So, for example, I have notes in my vault. I have notes in my Obsidian vault that represent individual people, and for those I use the tag #person, right? And any note that has that tag, I know represents a person, and they have particular properties. I have a template for those, etc. So that's one way to use tags. Another way to use tags. Yeah, sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just thought that that was interesting because I have a similar thing. I have a gente kind of bucket for people, but I have it as a folder, which is interesting because I don't usually use folders. But I realized one of the reasons that I shifted to using that as a folder rather than as a tag is because there's a plugin in Obsidian that lets you apply templates to folders. So anything I create in that folder automatically applies a template. Now, I know in something like Tana, they have the same thing, but for tags. And when I'm using Tana, maybe if I had chosen Tana, maybe I would have gone towards the tags instead. I think there are certain things like that where Obsidian just makes it easier to do that within a folder. So I use a folder. We also have a comment about folders actually that might be relevant. A question: what recommendations does Jorge have around folder structure? And what advice would he give to those who dislike folders and may dislike Obsidian's folder centric nature?
Yeah, that's a
I
good
never
question.
thought of Obsidian as folder centric.
Neither did I, actually, but that's a good question.
Interesting. Um, because like this might be kind of scary, but I do have folders. I have some, but like look at all of these notes. Majority of my notes are not in any sort of folder structure, and sometimes I show people this and they're like, how do you find anything?
Yeah,
I'm curious if you're willing to show your folder structure.
I can show my folder structure. Let me open my vault, and I will say that this is one of several vaults that I have, and they're all slightly different. But you'll notice that
Oh wow, very different.
mine is much simpler than yours, right? In that I don't have the notes in the kind of default location. Um, and I think that this might answer the question that we got there in the stream. I have folders right now for different types of things, right? So I told you that I have a hashtag person tag, right? And those all go into the people folder. And
Mm.
I use a plugin called Auto Note Mover, which which keeps folders organized for me. So any note that I tag with hashtag person goes into the people folder. Um, Circling back to your question about when I use folders versus tags, because now you might be thinking, it's like, well, if you have a tag called hashtag person, why do you have a people folder? Isn't that
Yeah.
duplicative, right? So the way that I think about this comes from something that my friend Carl Fast once said to me, and I'm going to paraphrase. He said that folders are for separating and tags are for uniting somehow. And I found that really helpful and insightful. And the idea is, I keep folders for things that I know I want to be able to refer to and that are of a specific type. So you'll notice that all of the things that I have here in folders are things that I hope you can know what to expect in those notes, right? So people, like I said, those are going to be notes about people. Um, uh, Ideas, those are my just like ideas that I've had. Lit notes are literature notes, things that I've my reflections on books that I've read. So for example, this is the lit note for the Schwarzenegger book, right? So those are all kind of the same type, and I do want to keep those separately from each other. But there are also and the thing that's different about tags from and folders is that folders are fo- eh, notes that are in folders can only ever have one parent at a time, right? Like so, this this uh, this note about the book be useful. It will only ever live in one of these folders. It will. I know that it will live in the lit notes folder, but there might be some things where I don't want such a strict separation between notes. I might want to create relationships kind of horizontally between them that span multiple containers, that span multiple silos. And actually, this vault is not the best example of that. Uh, but I have another vault where I keep notes about my projects, including like client work. I'm a consultant, so I do work for a lot of different clients. And in that case, I have folders that have that where I keep my meeting minutes, and I also have tags that represent what kind of meeting it was, for example. And using tags, I can create groups that don't have to be constrained to that one folder. They can kind of cut horizontally across, right? And that's what I get from that idea that folders are for separating and tags are for uniting, because folders let you keep things tidy in your file system. and and it's important to note that um, Obsidian is using your file system as the basic place where things are stored, right? And it's important for me that things be tidy there. But tags are what allow you to create relationships that transcend those containers, and that's super powerful, right? Like that's not something that you can do with paper. My bookshelves, they have to be organized just one way because physical things don't allow this, right? So there is a use for tags.
I guess the way that you talk about tags is the way that I use links, because I that is one of the reasons why I don't use folders as much, is because I really hate having to categorize things. Sometimes, I might have started just talking about work stuff, and then there was a point in my life where work and personal were very different. Now I'm finding that there are more things that belong in both buckets, and rather than having a tag for it, I kind of just prefer links and properties as well. We also actually have a question on that. Peter Nilsson asks, how come Jorge uses inline tags instead of properties?
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. And one thing, well, I'll say a couple of things about that. The first is that my way of doing this is continually evolving. All right, and I'm continually experimenting with things. And properties are a fairly new development in Obsidian, right? And I've been using tags for much longer than properties have been around. So that's one reason. But the other thing is that we talked about tags and we talked about folders and we've talked about links, but I also noted that I have different vaults, right? And a vault is also an organizational construct, right? And I said that I have the one that we're sharing on the screen right now is what I call my slip box, which is where I take notes about the things that I read and the things that I learn. But I said that I also have a separate vault for projects. And the that is a separation that I've kind of made in my mind. And to your point, Nicole, it's like sometimes I run into the challenge that's like, hey, it'd be ideal if these were shared between them. And I'll give you an example of that. Both of these vaults have a people folder. In the slip box, the people folder contains the authors of the books that I've read. So this note about Arnold Schwarzenegger, there's a note in my system about Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? And my projects folder also, or my projects vault also has a people folder. And the templates are very similar between them, right? And one of the downsides of my current structure is that because they are in separate vaults, I have to have two notes for some people, right? There are some people whose books I've read who I've also met with in real life. And as a result, I have a note in the projects vault and a note in this vault for them. And that's a downside to my current structure. But, and now I'm going to get to Peter's question here. The reason why I continue using inline tags as opposed to properties for some nodes is that one way that I am bridging the divide between my vaults is that I index all of my vaults using DEVONthink.
Oh,
And
okay.
DEVONthink it has a setting where, well, first of all, DEVONthink also understands Markdown and can render Markdown. DEVONthink also can follow wiki links, and they look identical to the ones in Obsidian. So a lot of the functionality that Obsidian provides for me as far as like viewing and navigating nodes, DEVONthink also provides. And DEVONthink has a setting that allows it to parse hashtag tags and assign them to nodes as DEVONthink tags. But it does not have that capability when you render tags in properties, in Obsidian's properties. So I keep using
Mm.
inline tags because I want Obsidian to index it properly. Not Obsidian, sorry, DEVONthink to index it properly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Peter's also talking about the metadata there, like the title and the publisher and stuff.
Oh,
Um, Yeah, and I actually have something to say on this as well because I have this is my vault now. This is a role-playing game system that I recently took notes on. I have like a cheat sheet there, and I also use inline tags for a different reason than what you were using them for. And this is because I publish this. And so there's
mm,
that split of like some things are just for me. And if it were just for me, then it doesn't really matter if it's a property here or like an inline parameter. But if I'm publishing it, the YAML front matter, because this is all just YAML here, that's not going to be shown when it's published, whereas these will. So
mm,
for me, this is a little bit more useful because it's useful for me as the person that wrote it and is just looking at this privately, and it's also useful for other people who might chance upon this page in my published vault.
yeah. No, that's a really good reason. In my case, and now I get Peter's question, and I was misreading tags there. I think of these as properties more than tags. Uh, the reason for this one, Peter, is that it's just purely inertia. Like this is the template that I've used for a long time, and like I said, it precedes properties in Obsidian. And the thing is, and this now gives me the opportunity to preach a little bit. One of the big challenges, one of the big risks with doing this kind of thinking using tools like Obsidian is what I call meta work, where work is the actual sitting down and thinking about what you read about in this book or what you learned or the meeting minutes or whatever. So anything that you're trying to actually do to think with the system. And meta work is all of the work that goes into keeping the system running, right? So it's I'm going to play around with new plugins. I'm going to optimize my
I feel
templates.
called out.
Well, I mean, it happens to me too, right? And it's and the thing that I find risky about this is that I love doing this. I love like playing with new plugins and tweaking my templates and all this stuff. And I've kind of had to train myself to not do that as much. It's like do the minimum necessary to keep it humming. And for me, like the properties were working fine as they were kind of inline. And I haven't seen a big need to go back, because then what happens is I'm also a little OCD about this stuff. And it's like, okay, so then I changed my template, and now from now on, all my notes are going to have the new format. But then I have this cutoff where all my older notes have a different format, and now I'm like, I'm starting to become anxious. Like it's starting to become messy, right? But yeah, the meta work is the big thing there. Like I want to spend more time actually thinking with my system than working on the system. I hope that distinction is helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have another question from Nicia Cruz. Is there a way to create nested tags that don't become too crowded with too many slashes, yet to have the notes organized in specific subjects that are interrelated? Would you like to answer this?
Well, my reaction on reading that was that I try to be very minimal with my tags. And I said that I had 3 ways of using tags, and I only mentioned one. I want to mention the other 2, but specifically, Nicia, there was a time when I was using hierarchical tags in Obsidian, and I actually moved away from that. Again, it felt to me like I was starting to make it overly baroque. Like it is possible to go overboard with this stuff. I wonder what you're needing to categorize that would call for more than a couple of levels of hierarchy. My sense is that the more minimal you can make your use of tags, the happier you're going to be in the long run. I shouldn't say that because everyone has different needs, right? But for me, being fairly minimal about this stuff helps. And this is a good opportunity for me to tell you about the other 2 uses for tags. So I said that the first one was to describe what a note represents, right? A second one is to explicitly tie that note to a set. So an example of that might be if you're working on a project, right? When I was working on the book on Duly Noted, I had a hashtag that was hashtag Duly Noted, and the reason for that was that I was always on the lookout for things, ideas, stories that might be helpful with the book. And whenever I came across an idea that seemed to be a candidate, I could use that tag and circle back to it later. And by the way, here's a tip. If you're using something like the Readwise plugin that allows you to sync your Kindle highlights with Obsidian, you can use hashtags in your Kindle highlights, in your Kindle notes, right? So that I would do that. Like if I was reading a book and I came across a quote or something that I thought would be helpful for the book, I would write a note in the Kindle app that had the hashtag Duly Noted. And then I knew
And
that,
the links
yeah.
work too. The
Yes.
tags work, the links work, and then also if you have a note, so I like to highlight the outlines of books. and then you can have a note there that's like .h1, and it'll preserve that hierarchy as well within the highlights.
That's right. It's incredibly powerful, right? Like this notion, like we're so blessed that we have plain text to work with, right?
Yeah,
Plain text is a marvel.
I actually want to show that with your book. Look,
All
so
right.
I took these notes, and I this is like directly from Readwise. But look at all the nice hierarchies that are already preserved. That's just because, I would highlight this and I would do .h1, and then this one would be like .h2, and that way I'm like, oh, this is the outline of Jorge's book.
And this is incredibly helpful when you're circling back to reflect on what you read, right? Like because you have immediately you having the outline is a great
Yeah.
it's just a great prompt for you to think, oh yeah, that chapter was about this thing, right?
Yeah. So like how I process this, so I haven't finished it, but I did have like some things that some main points that I thought you had made in this particular book, and I was going back and forth between this one and the kind of like my own notes of the highlights on one side and then my own notes on the other. And then to Nisia's point, or to her question, I guess, one thing that I would suggest for that is to think of creating maybe a map of content instead, and use links to organize what you're trying to do there. Because if you have too many slashes, that kind of says to me that you have more to say on the topic than what tags can really give you. And so if that's the case, then, like this page is one on observability, and it's like full of links to other pages. So I could have like observability slash metrics or slash traces, and then, each one would have more as well, like this one's server metrics or whatever. But I find it useful to just have a page for observability and then have links within that. So I guess it kind
Mm.
of depends. I mean, maybe start with the tags, and then once you start to think like, oh, this is getting so unwieldy or crowded in what Nisia said, then maybe think about changing them to a note. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, you could do that. And I think that if you there are approaches that explicitly call for that. I'm thinking of Sunke Arends's book, How to Take Smart Notes. I think that he talks about that, having these kind of index notes, right? Which comes from Luhmann's approach. Um, they I just want to circle back to the third use for tags, because
Oh,
this is gonna
sorry.
have payoff for Nisia's comment, I think, or question. The third use is for indicating state. And what is state? State is this a draft? Is this published? Is this active?
Oh,
Is this
that's a good
inactive?
one. Yeah.
Right. So think about that. I've described three taxonomies, right? So three taxonomies. One is, what type of thing is this? The second is, what set does it belong to? And the third is, what state is it in? And what I have found is that with those three things, with those three taxonomies, you can describe a lot of things that you would otherwise do in kind of very rigidly structured hierarchies. And I'll give you an example. I used to have the one use that I had for nested tags or hierarchical tags was in my projects vault, I have a hashtag project to say this is a project, right? This node is about a project. And then I had sub tags for that. I had project slash active and project slash inactive. But what eventually the realization I had was that, hey, I have other types of things in this vault that I'm also going to want to mark as active or inactive. So really, active and inactive are not children of the project tag. They are a tag type in itself. And just keeping in mind these three taxonomies, type, set, and state, you can, if you just try to be disciplined about just keeping it to that and not trying to be overly descriptive, I find that you can
Mm,
describe a lot of things with literally one level of tags. Like you don't have to
mhm.
go very deep into hierarchies.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that I think most people think of tags as um, a way to categorize, but it's a useful, and that's why you would nest them, because you can have an infinite number of buckets. But thinking of type, set, and state kind of distinguishes them more from links. There's still a few other ways of organizing, though, especially in something like Obsidian. So there's links and tags, and we've also touched on folders, and we did mention properties as well. Something to note is that I use Dataview quite heavily, and that uses the properties in Obsidian to turn your notes into a sort of database in a very SQL like. It really is like you're querying a database of your notes. Do you use that at all?
I do use Dataview. I've used it for things like, again, in my projects vault, I use it more there than I do in the Slipbox. In the projects vault, I use it for things like, I mentioned that I have a note called a project note, type of note called a project note, and each one of those projects has a data view in them that lists all of the meetings related to that project, right? And you can do that with the backlinks panel. But I find it convenient to do that. Although I must say that I am fairly sparing in my use of things like Dataview, um, because I mentioned earlier I'm also using DEVONthink to index these things, and Dataview is something that obviously only renders within Obsidian. So one of the reasons why I use Obsidian is because it saves everything as plain text in the computer. And I want to keep my notes in plain text as much as possible. And that means relying as little as possible on things that I can only see within Obsidian. And of course, there are some things that are super powerful that you can only do by doing that. I think, I forget what it's called in Obsidian, but transclusions, basically the notion that you can render the text of one node or part of the text of one node within another node. That's another example of that, right? That's super powerful, but I can't see that when looking at my notes in the terminal or in DEVONthink. So I'm very mindful about the use of that.
Yeah, it's a sustainability thing for sure.
Yeah.
We have a question from Robert Gottlieb, who asks, when taking notes for something live like this talk or a meeting at work, is there an easy way to decide when to link versus tag something?
I don't think there is, Robert, at least not for me. And I've decided to not even try. So I'll tell you what I do. I have
Oh,
a paper.
wow.
I have a paper notebook, and again, think about what I said earlier. I am using these things as a way to extend my mind. I am doing the thinking between here on the page or between here on the screen, and I find that trying to think in real time about whether something should be a link or a tag or what have you is too distracting from what I'm trying to do in the meeting or in the lecture, which is I'm trying to listen, you
Yeah.
know?
So I do
And
something
yeah.
very similar. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I don't take physical notes, but I do try to distinguish between when I'm taking notes as I'm listening and when I'm actually processing them for later. So when I'm taking notes on a talk or a video or something, I don't have any notes. I mean, I don't have any links or any tags or properties. I'm just like, oops, I think I got lost for a second there.
You froze
But I
there.
was
Yeah.
saying I was saying that I don't, I'm just trying to get stuff down on the
Yeah.
spot. Afterwards, once I've gone through the whole talk or whatever, then I will start to link, maybe tag, start to add properties. That's when I think about organization and where can I put this so that I can find it later. But to have that additional layer of structure while I'm initially listening to it, it's so much. I can't handle that.
Yeah, and in the book, in Duly Noted, there is a process, basically flow chart that talks about different stages, right? And the capture stage is quite distinct from the organizing stage in my mind. And I see links and tags and stuff like that as being very much the sort of reflection that happens when you're sitting down and organizing things.
Okay. So there's also another thing that we haven't talked about, which is file names. And I'm specifically thinking of how Niklas Luhmann created his slipbox, the original Zettelkasten, and he actually had a very specific prefix that he would use. It was the date, and then he would do like the number, and then A, B, C, depending on. I mean, think of this being on index cards, so physical things. So he couldn't just add something to an index card at one point. The index card would be full. Then he'd have another one. So I think some digital note takers also still use file names as a way to organize. What do you do that at all, or what do you think of that?
I don't do that. And and I wonder, well, my sense is that Luhmann did that because of the constraints of the medium he was working with, right? I think that Luhmann, and I'm not a Luhmann scholar in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I think I've read the same things that everyone else has read about it, but I get the sense that he's someone who was trying to do with paper the sort of things that we're doing with tools like Obsidian, and trying to find the best way to do it within the limitations of the medium he was working with. And I don't know if he would have done the same thing had he had access to something like Obsidian, right? I mean, the whole point, as far as I understand it, the whole point of that naming scheme was to be able to easily locate pieces of paper within these enormous physical cabinets, and we don't have that problem with Obsidian, right? Like, we have search, and we have links, and we have things that can use we can use as names, things that we can parse as human beings. Like, we don't have to those the names that Luhmann used, I think, were more for the benefit of being able to work within the constraints of the medium than they were for the benefit of the human being trying to make sense of what is there. The one constraint that we have to deal with is that our notes need to be uniquely named, right? Like, you can't have two notes with the same name, and that has, that has some constraints. That adds some constraints to the naming scheme, but I definitely opt for the keeping names legible to myself as a human, rather than for some kind of like systems reason. I will say that the one type of note where I do have a particular naming schema is when capturing meeting minutes. And that's just because, again, the point is to help me as a person easily find things, even in the absence of a tool like Obsidian. And for meeting minutes, what I'll do is I'll start the note name with the date in the standard ISO format, with year dash month dash date, and then the project name, which can be a shorthand, and then I usually also append at the end the letters ext or int, depending on whether it's an external meeting or an internal meeting. That being like a meeting with my client or a meeting with my team. And that's like a little shorthand that I've come up with for myself, and I just have like years of doing that. And again, keep in mind that I am using these notes and consulting these notes from outside Obsidian as well, right? So for me, naming it's very important.
Oh, we have a comment from our mutual friend Andy Plain, who says that folders are just tags in a different form, like dividers in a big ring binder. For me, and this is where I think he's wrong, I think that tags are way more flexible, if only because folders are a metaphor for something very physical. They can still only be, a note can only be in one folder, but one note can have multiple tags. So I would always go for tags over folders in that respect.
That's the key distinction. Folders, notes in a folder can only ever have one parent, whereas, like you said, tags, you can assign as many tags to as many. It's a one-to-many relationship versus a many-to-many
Mhm.
relationship, right? And that makes a big difference.
Quick question here from Yeltsin. Talking about links and tags, what's your take on the approach of Rome and Logseek as they do not discriminate between the two? A link is also a tag and vice versa. I do wonder if, because I came from Rome to Obsidian, well, and Notion a bit, there's an overlap there too. But I do wonder if maybe I tend to be more link focused because of this background, because in Rome, when you click on the tag, it becomes like its own note. So it's kind of more like a link in that way. Do you have, you already had a distinction between folders and tags. Do you have one between links and tags?
For me, the key distinction between links and tags is that a tag, a link is kind of like a one-off thing. Like it's a link is pointing to and I do see what Yeltsin is saying there, and I have used Rome. Like I said, I have not used Logseek, uh, but uh, but the main difference for me is that I think of links as pointing to objects within the system. I'm trying to be very broad in the way that I'm describing it, but they point at a specific object within the system, whether it's a note or a file or a web page or I use a tool called Hookmark. I don't know if you've seen this code, but on the Mac,
Yes.
it's right. So it's a tool that allows you to have links to pretty much any document in the system, right, or a wide range of documents in your Mac. So it's not just notes, right? And I think of links as being kind of addresses to these particular locations within the system. Whereas I think of tags, and you're right, like the mechanics of navigating them look a lot like links, but I think of their function as different. Whereas links are pointers to specific addresses, tags are ways of describing what a thing is or its state or what group it belongs to.
Mm.
And again, even though the mechanics are similar, I think that the reason for using them is completely different, right? And I think it's worthwhile to keep that distinction in mind. In particular, if you're doing what I'm doing, which is I'm using these nodes with other tools. I'm not just using them within Obsidian, right? And in a tool like DEVONthink, uh, the tags and links are very, very different. They're not the same at all, right? So it's just the nature of Logseek and Rome that the mechanics of them make them more similar than necessary.
We're already a bit over time, but I do want to talk about your book, Duly Noted.
Mm.
Tell us about it. What is it about and who's it for?
Well, Duly Noted is about the sort of thing that we've been talking about here, right? So the idea is if you buy into this idea we've been talking about that we extend our minds through things in the world, then if you are a knowledge worker or someone who is a student or a teacher or someone who works with their mind or who learns, like maybe you love reading like I do, right? And you want to somehow empower yourself and augment your cognitive abilities, if you buy into this notion that we extend our minds through the things that we interact with in the world, it behooves you to search out ways to do that better, right? And I think that we are living in a time where we are very, very fortunate to have tools like Obsidian, Rome, Logseek, Notion, etc. Right? Like I said, these things used to be only available in research labs, and now they're cheap and easy to use, right? And Duly Noted aims to teach you principles and practices to make the best use possible of these tools to help you think better. So I'm not going to be giving you any specific frameworks like you have to do this and this is the right way and wrong way to structure your folders or what have you. All I'm saying is, people have been organizing information and in general, but digital information in particular for a long time now. And there are principles that we can learn from that will help make the augmentation of our minds through tools like Obsidian and their ilk much better. And that's what Duly Noted aims to do. It aims to give you principles and practices to help you think better in an information environment that is getting more complex every day, right? So it's like we have more stuff coming at us, but we also have tools like these. So it behooves you to learn to use tools like these. And that's what the book tries to do.
I really recommend it to anyone who's watching. I talked to Jorge while he was writing it, and I was lucky enough to be able to get a sneak peek, and I'm also in it.
You're
So that
in the
shows.
book, I was about to say, yeah.
Yeah, no, but I really do love it. I love that it is not preaching a methodology. There's nothing there that you're selling. You don't have a course. You don't have any stake in this. You're just trying to give real practical information about how in the world we can make sense of our notes and take notes that actually matter. So I really enjoyed it, and I'm excited for people to read it in a few days.
Yeah, it comes out January 2nd. And thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you have to roll your own. Like, you have to make the system your own. Nobody's going to be able to tell you how to create a system that helps you think better. You have to do it. But there are principles that you can apply to, like I was saying, like I have pretty strong opinions about how to use tags. And they're not theoretical. Like I struggled with it
Mhm.
myself. Like I said, it's like I can't describe everything about this thing using tags. But if I limit myself to these three taxonomies, then I can make better use of it, right? And it's stuff like that. It's like a kit for you to assemble your own, right? Like roll your own and
I like
experiment with
that.
it. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Jorge. And where can people go to learn more about you and follow your work?
Well, people can find out more about me in my website, which is jarango.com. And you can find out more about the book at its website, which is dulynoted.fyi.
And both of those are in the description below, so check out those links. Thank you, Jorge, and
Awesome.
thank you everybody for coming on Christmas week as well. It was nice to chat with everybody.
This has been fun. And it's a perfect week because people oftentimes are taking time out to reorganize themselves, right? So if you're doing
Yeah.
that, best of luck to you. And, we're all doing a little bit of that ourselves.
All right. Thanks everyone, and happy holidays, and have a good new year, hopefully.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank